PBS.
By ODS Health Plan, the group medical plan that meets the needs of more than 600,000 Oregonians by providing a broad range of medical and dental coverage and responsive service.
Good evening. I'm Robert MacNeil in New York.
And I'm Roger Mudd in Washington. After the news summary, we go first to an update report on one town's battle against the Mississippi floodwaters. Then we spend the rest of the news hour focusing on 3 trouble spots in the former Soviet Union.
New York Life is proud to provide funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer News Hour. Yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. Funding has also been provided by PepsiCo. And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. ADM, supermarket to the world. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Much of the country faced dangerous weather today. Records were set along the Mississippi River as floodwaters continued to rise, particularly in Missouri and Iowa, and rain kept falling. There were up to 3 inches in parts of Iowa along the Des Moines River, a tributary of the Mississippi. The governor said 2,500 Iowa families have been forced from their homes. President Clinton sent a radio message from the Tokyo summit to flood victims. He promised to ask Congress next week for emergency federal disaster relief. We'll have more on the situation in one Missouri town right after the news summary. On the East Coast, the problem was record heat. Temperatures were in the high 90s and low hundreds up into New England. The Weather Service said the heat and humidity would remain at least through Tuesday. Roger?
On the second day of the Tokyo summit, U.S. officials said the Big 7 nations would put up more than $3 billion in aid to Russia. Russian President Boris Yeltsin flew to Tokyo today to make his case. Administration officials said the aid will include $375 million from the U.S. in form of direct grants, technical assistance, and export credits, some of which had already been approved by the Congress. The U.S. originally had wanted the Big 7 to give Russia $4 billion, but President Clinton said he was pleased nonetheless.
I came here with the hope of getting $500 million in a privatization fund to help convert these government-owned industries to private sector industries. And the Europeans have really come forward. I talked to a lot of them in the last week, and it appears to me that we'll have at least $500 million in that fund and an aid package that will probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion. So that is very good. It's also very good for America. I mean, there's a lot of business to be done in Russia by Americans to create American jobs, business in energy and natural resources, in environmental technologies, and all kinds of consumer operations. This is a huge new market for American goods and services.
The summit leaders also issued a statement warning the Serbs and Croats in Bosnia against partitioning the republic by force, ethnic cleansing, or homicide. They vowed to maintain sanctions but threatened no specific new action to force compliance. UN envoy Thorvald Stoltenberg continued a peace effort in the region, warning today of worsening bloodshed if a solution did not come this month. He said the talks, which the Bosnian Muslim leader has so far boycotted, were at a critical moment. The World Health Organization also had grim predictions for Bosnia, saying today Sarajevo faced catastrophe on a scale unseen since World War II. It said the health and medical services in Sarajevo were on the verge of collapse. Aid agencies said the city's 380,000 residents were resorting to desperate measures to stay alive.
Separatists and government forces continue their battles today in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. The fighting was for control of the province of Abkhazia, where the provincial capital of Sukhumi appeared close to falling. Diplomats from the U.S. and half a dozen other nations flew to the region in a show of support for Georgian President Shevardnadze. We have a report narrated by Richard Vaughn of Worldwide Television News.
The noose tightens around the necks of Sukhumi's Georgian defenders as artillery shells and rockets pound the besieged streets. It's one of only 2 cities in the region the rebels haven't captured. On Thursday, shattered Sukhumi woke up to the devastation caused by the overnight barrage. The Abkhazians had seized the power station overlooking the city. That meant its hapless citizens wouldn't be getting electricity or water. The rebels have been attacking Sukhumi for a week. They've reached the only road out of the city and cut it off from the rest of Georgia. President Eduard Shevardnadze stayed in Sukhumi to supervise its defense. He tried to comfort people and boost their morale, but he admitted his troops faced defeat. The ambassadors of the United States, France, Russia, Germany, Israel, Iran, and the UN all flew to Sukhumi to meet with Shevardnadze. They'd taken quite a risk. Only hours earlier, a Georgian helicopter had been shot down. All 23 on board were killed. The Georgians said the helicopter had been downed by the Abkhazians. The presence of the Russian ambassador couldn't have led Shevardnadze to expect much out of the meeting. Despite Russian mediation to end the fighting, Shevardnadze accuses Russia of waging a secret war against Georgia by helping the rebels.
Heavy fighting was also reported in the former Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan. The battles there were between Armenian and Azerbaijani troops over control of Nagorno-Karabakh, an ethnic Armenian enclave. Armenian forces have expanded their offensive in recent weeks, capturing territory in Azerbaijan proper. We'll have more on the conflicts in Azerbaijan and Georgia later in the program.
The head of the United Nations Special Commission on Iraq today said UN inspectors will try to seal and thus shut down 2 Iraqi missile test sites. The announcement came after Iraq rejected UN attempts to install surveillance cameras at the sites. Under the UN Gulf War ceasefire resolutions, Iraq had agreed to the monitoring. Commission head Rafi Kayes was asked whether the UN action might provoke a new confrontation with Iraq.
We give Iraq now a choice. Either they carry out continuing testing if they so like, while being monitored, effectively monitored. These cameras, as you know, will be very, very good in this respect. Or they are not allowed to carry out. They are only allowed to carry out their activities if they... so they have the choice. If they don't want to carry out any test, there is no need for cameras. If Iraq then chooses confrontation, certainly not the Special Commission and it's not the Security Council. We are not, on the contrary, we have, I think, been quite generous here.
UN inspectors leave for Iraq this weekend to seal the sites. Iraq has given no indication whether it will cooperate. Amnesty International today released its annual report on human rights abuses around the world. The report had sharp words for the U.S. policy of forcibly repatriating Haitian refugees. Amnesty Secretary General Pierre Sain also criticized Western European countries for passing laws to restrict the immigration of Eastern Europeans. He said the plight of 250,000 Bosnian refugees in Croatia was particularly desperate. He said no one wants to take them, and that means they will be sent back to a slaughterhouse.
224 U.S. Marines went ashore on the north coast of Somalia today. Officials said they were on a training and humanitarian mission. The UN Special Envoy to Somalia said the Marines landed at Bosaso to help rebuild damaged buildings, clinics, and schools. They will also help train local police. The operation is expected to take no more than 4 days. The Marines are part of an amphibious unit stationed in the Indian Ocean.
The price of a postage stamp will not go up for at least 2 years. Postmaster General Marvin Runyon today said cost-cutting and management reforms had eliminated the need for any increase until 1995. Runyon also said sales of the Elvis Presley stamp turned a profit of $25 million. He said it was the first time in the history of the Independent Postal Service that rates will have stayed the same for 4 years in a row. No one knows the name of the winner, but whoever bought that lottery ticket in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin will get $110 million. That's the prize in the so-called Powerball lottery, which was held last night in 14 states in the District of Columbia. The odds were 55 million to 1 against winning. There was only one ticket with all 6 correct numbers. It was sold just hours before the drawing, but as of late today, no one had come forward with the richest single lottery ticket in U.S. history. Good for $5.5 million a year before taxes for 20 years.
Former Lincoln Savings and Loan Chairman Charles Keating was sentenced today to 12.5 years in federal prison for racketeering and fraud. Losses from the 1989 collapse of the Lincoln S&L cost taxpayers nearly $3 billion. That's it for the news summary. Still ahead, the Mississippi's floodwaters and Europe's other wars, fighting in the former Soviet Union.
The Great Mississippi River Flood of 1993 is once again our lead focus. In a radio address from Tokyo today, President Clinton said he would ask Congress next week to approve emergency disaster aid for the victims of the flooding. Farming communities and towns from St. Paul to St. Louis continue trying to hold back the rain-swollen Mississippi River. Rain is now causing flooding along the Missouri River in Nebraska. Correspondent Elizabeth Brackett has an update report on the battle against the floodwaters in West Alton, Missouri.
Yesterday, the Moccans of West Alton, Missouri were still in control of their levee, sandbagging the low spots of the 2.5-mile levee that protected their fields and homes. Today, the Mississippi was in charge. Ray Mocken could only find the levee he had spent so many hours on with an 8-foot oar.
Well, usually when these wash down, they'll wash down almost straight up and down and they blow out like that. Nothing there. She took it out.
Mocken had gotten the call about 11 last night that the levee had been broken. The results were almost immediate. Yesterday, the Mockens' 1,200 acres of soybeans and corn had been relatively dry. Today, the only way to cross that field was by boat. But the Mockens had prepared. Yesterday, Gary and Elizabeth Mocken had emptied their house. They thought they would have a few days more to beat the rising waters. Today, they knew that work had been worth it. Still, the stress was there.
When it first started coming in, you know, we could see it in the fields behind us, and then we were racing around trying to get the last-minute stuff done, and it was eerie, very spooky, and to see everything that you've worked very hard at to go into the water. It's tough. What about it is so hard? The work we have to do to put things back the way we want it. You don't do a house in a year. It takes a long time to work on things, and we're going to have to start all over. And not only as far as the farm, but as far as the house. And it's tough. It's tough.
West Alton was not alone. Levee breaks were occurring all along the Mississippi. The hard work of the last few days sandbagging washed away by the ever-rising waters. Hundreds along the river were packing up belongings. For those who waited too long, rescue by boat was the only option.
Oh, golly. Now let me hang on to you so I can get out.
Towns like West Alton had hoped to control the amount of water coming down their streets. One of the key spots, these sandbags that stretched across the main street yesterday. At the same spot today, Gary Mocken recalls the strategy.
The decision was made to cut the levee here where the highway goes over the levee and align the bags properly and let a controlled flow in to keep down personal property damage and keep a large break happening in the levee system.
But the plan had not worked. The levee had been broken a half-mile upstream, and an angry Gary Mocken says it was man, not nature, that had caused the break.
Last night about 9 o'clock, 4 of us witnessed a boat crash through 4 rolls of sandbags here.
You were standing here you were standing here in
we
their
were boating around the edge of these woods. They didn't see us coming because we were over here by these woods. And
you were checking
we
the levee?
witnessed them just running straight. Yeah, we were checking the levee and witnessed a boat run through here, and water patrol's been down and confiscated a boat.
What were your thoughts when you saw this boat heading toward the levee? They were in the river out here, heading toward the levee.
That they were nuts, that they were trying to cut the levee to relieve pressure on from their side.
So there's no doubt in your mind that they did it on purpose?
There's no doubt. There's 4 people to witness the whole thing and say there's no doubt.
The problem with the break in the levee goes beyond these flooded fields. It will take several months before these fields are dry, and then it will cost at least $100,000 to fix this earthen levee. All that time, the town remains much more vulnerable to the waters of the Mississippi. There is little to be done now in West Alton. The water on the main street is now level with the river water, and the crest here is not predicted until next Wednesday.
While Boris Yeltsin is in Tokyo securing aid from the leading industrial democracies, at least 3 civil wars are raging on his Russian borders. Tonight we examine what threats these conflicts pose to peace in the already volatile region where Islam and Christianity coexist. We begin with the civil war in Georgia. More than 1,000 people have died in the efforts of Muslims in the Abkhazia region to break away from the republic. We start with a background report from Charlene Hunter-Galt.
The capital of Georgia is Tbilisi, a modern, ethnically diverse city of more than 1 million people. In these scenes taken before the Soviet Union's collapse, Lenin stood triumphant in the main square. But there were few additional signs of communism. Though very much a part of the Soviet Union, Georgia has managed to preserve its own character. Its people have a reputation as entrepreneurs, natural-born capitalists. They produce enough food in their cooperatives to feed themselves and are quite prosperous by Soviet standards. Georgia's Black Sea resorts used to be a favorite getaway spot for vacation-minded Muscovites, but that was before April 9, 1989, better known as Bloody Sunday. That night, with the Soviet Union slowly splintering, Georgians gathered in Tbilisi's main square to demand independence. Soviet troops, under orders to quash the demonstration, encircled the crowd and began clubbing people. 20 demonstrators were killed. It was the latest chapter in Georgia's tumultuous history of revolts and invasion, unification and dissolution.
In the 18th century, Georgia underwent a series of devastating invasions from Persia. It was divided, it was weak, and at that point, the Georgian kings began to petition the Russian czars, particularly Catherine the Great, to establish a protectorate over Georgia. And in 1783, at the Treaty of Georgievsk, Catherine agreed to this.
Agreed, and then later claimed the Georgian provinces as part of the Tsarist Empire. Separate Georgian principalities were joined, and a single Georgian economy and culture was created. Then came the 1917 Russian Revolution, and a year later, Georgian independence. At the time, Georgian society was largely rural and strictly divided between peasants and nobles. Its leaders, moderate Marxists known as Mensheviks, envisioned a classless communist society. But unlike the hardline Bolsheviks in Moscow, they wanted a democratic society and an essentially capitalist economy. Reforms which took land from the nobility and put it in the private hands of peasants won the Mensheviks' widespread allegiance.
And for nearly 3 years, Georgia was an independent social democratic republic, very democratic, had ties with the West, was recognized by the West, had visits from prominent socialists in the West, and developed a quite flourishing system, but it was all brought to an end in February 1921 with the invasion of the Red Army.
There were bloody reprisals, but the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin eventually adopted a policy of tolerance. Lenin nurtured the seeds of Georgian nationalism, perhaps unintentionally, by promoting Georgian language magazines and newspapers and building schools. Under his rule, the economy, devastated by World War I, began to grow, as did the ranks of the Bolsheviks. Lenin died in 1924, and Georgian-born Joseph Stalin emerged as the new head of the Soviet Communist Party. Stalin was ruthless. During his 25-year reign, he forced the peasants off their land and into large collectives where they became, in effect, serfs of the state. He also instituted central planning for all of the republics.
This is the moment, the Stalinist years, of the greatest centralization. Beginning with Stalin and continuing even after Stalin, there was a very serious policy of limiting national expression.
With the death of Stalin in 1953, Georgian nationalism, suppressed for 30 years, was reborn. A national film industry, theater, and opera flourished. But nationalism also had a dark side. Discrimination against Georgia's ethnic minorities, which made up 30% of the population, sharply increased. For Georgia's Communist Party, the post-Stalin era meant greater autonomy and enormous power.
With more autonomy on the one hand and no democracy, what you get is the rise of what I would call national mafias, local communist elites who take power, run the economy largely in their own interest, actually enrich themselves quite successfully in many republics, as in Central Asia and indeed in the Caucasus.
In 1972, Edward Shevardnadze was named head of the Georgian Communist Party. His assignment, root out the corruption. Shevardnadze was more successful than anyone could have expected, but it was an impossible task. Georgia declared its independence from the Soviet Union on April 9, 1991, 2 years to the day after Bloody Sunday. But the transition to democracy rapidly disintegrated into civil war.
Since Shevardnadze was elected president of Georgia a year ago, his government has withstood challenges from his political rivals only to face an independence movement in the predominantly Muslim Abkhazi region near the Black Sea. Abkhazi forces now control much of the countryside and surround the provincial capital of Sukhumi. The Georgians charge the Abkhazis have received tacit, if not overt, support from Russian forces. Today, Shevardnadze said his Georgian army could be defeated by the Abkhazis. With us are Jack Matlock, former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Elizabeth Teague, senior research analyst at Radio Free Europe and a fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ms. Teague, who are these Abkhazis and why do they want to break away from Shevardnadze's Georgia?
Well, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that we shouldn't be surprised by any of this. The fact that these revolts are breaking out throughout the former Soviet Union, it all stems from the very deliberate way in which Stalin constructed the Soviet system, whereby small ethnic minorities were given autonomy within larger republics and were used by Stalin to act so that they were given this autonomy that they could only defend by appealing to Moscow against the republics to which they were notionally subordinated. So the fact that when the communist system collapsed and the system of violence used to control a population was eroded, the fact that these national minorities now start to seek their autonomy shouldn't be surprising at all, but that Stalin set up this entire system to enable the Soviet Union to be run from Moscow, and the fact that it's collapsing now is really only what we should have expected.
Well, now, who are these Abkhazis and what?
The Abkhazs, in fact, are not even a majority in Abkhazia. They're only 17% of the population. The Georgians deny that they're even an ethnic, real culturally different, ethnically different from the Georgians. The Georgians say they're just Georgian Muslims. The Abkhaz deny this, of course, but the main problem, I think, is that the majority of the population is Georgian. The main problem is not really a nationalist one, I think. Nationalism is being used as a rallying point to gather support, given that the communist ideology has eroded. It has to be replaced by something. Nationalism is a handy thing to replace it with. But I think the real problem really is the real thing that people are arguing about is property. There's the former Soviet Union clearly was based on the idea of state property. Now things are being privatized. You've got new elites coming to power. They're looking about for reasons to explain why it should be this group of people should organize themselves around this very desirable piece of property, this long, fertile strip of Abkhazia along the Black Sea, loads of beautiful hotels there, but not only that, important military bases, possibly naval bases on the Black Sea.
So it's a real estate struggle.
There's a very, very large element of that.
Ambassador Matlock, do you see it that way? And in addition to that, what about religious and ethnic and political factors here? What do you see as they...
I think at root, Elizabeth Teague is absolutely right. It is a property question, and it's one which the state-owned property of the past has sort of set them up for. Because, in effect, you had a situation whereby winner takes all, not just political power, but also the property in the republic or in the region. Now, in this, of course, national factors, language, other things are used as rallying points by increasingly unscrupulous leaders. But I think that the roots are not so much the cultural differences as the fight over power.
And what part are the Russians playing in this? Shevardnadze has alleged that the Russians are actually helping the Abkhazis. What is the Russian interest in this, and what are they doing in it? Do we know?
There were Russian units in the area. There still are some. The local commanders have been accused by Shevardnadze and by the Georgians of taking sides. To what degree this has been authorized or encouraged by Moscow is very hard for an outsider to say. I think objectively speaking, Russian units have been in action against Georgian units. So I think Shevardnadze's charges have some basis to them. The Russian interest was essentially one first of all, of protecting the Russian population. When fighting broke out, there are many Russians there. But then other motives, of course, get mixed up in that process.
Could the Abkhazians win this? Could they actually defeat Shevardnadze's Georgians? And if they did, what would that mean?
I think it's possible, given that they do seem to be having support from outside, partly from renegade Russian units, as Jack Matlock said, partly also from this confederation of mountain peoples of the Caucasus, a militarized group of about 14 different Caucasian groups, which is sending irregular troops to fight in Abkhazia. The problem, of course, is that Georgia doesn't want to give away a very valuable piece of real estate. That's the main problem.
Okay. Well, we'll move on and come back to that situation in a few moments. South of Georgia is a far more costly war in which neighboring Armenians and Azerbaijanis are fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian territory in the midst of Azerbaijan. Once again, Charlene Hunter-Gault has some background.
To the Russians, they are the Transcaucasian republics, literally across the Caucasian Mountains. Tucked into the southwestern corner of the former Soviet Union, Armenia and Azerbaijan have long served as both a buffer zone and battleground between the empires of East and West. Today, these neighbors wage an undeclared war, fighting over borders created by their old communist bosses. But the enmity predates the Soviet era by centuries. When the Red Army rolled into the Caucasus, it found these towers of blood revenge, relics of medieval feuds. Armenia was the smallest of the 15 Soviet republics, but in the 1st century BC, it stretched from the Mediterranean to the Black and Caspian Seas. In the year 314, Armenia became the first state to adopt Christianity. Armenians invented an alphabet with which to translate the Bible, making beautifully illuminated manuscripts. Over the following centuries, as the nation was invaded by waves of Arabs, Persians, Turks, and Mongols, the Armenian Apostolic Church buttressed national identity.
Armenians lived in a sea of Muslims, and Christianity in many ways was the center of the Armenian culture and civilization through most of its history.
For Armenians, their greatest enemies have been the Ottoman Turks, who conquered Armenia in the 16th century and regarded their subjects with unease. But in 1920, the Soviets took over eastern Armenia and made it a republic. Its neighbor to the east was the Republic of Azerbaijan, a relatively young nation by Armenian standards. It had been formed only 2 years earlier, during the chaos following World War I and the Russian Revolution. For millennia, control of Azerbaijan had seesawed between Iranians and Turks. Azerbaijan's culture is a blend of both. The language is a Turkic dialect. The religion, the Shiite variety of Islam prevalent in Iran.
Baku is the center of one of the most important oil fields of the world. Some of the oil pools stretch way out under the Caspian Sea. And in order to get the oil out, they have had to drill wells down through the water.
Baku was a turn-of-the-century boom town, attracting many Russians as well as Armenians, who were better educated than the Azerbaijanis and got the better jobs. Resentments took root.
Azerbaijanis, in their rhetoric, very much have a sense that they are the oppressed people of the region, that they have been denied their full expression, that they are not favored by they were never favored by the Russian or the Soviet regime, and that Armenians were always given privilege.
The Russians occasionally exploited these tensions, inciting Armenians and Azerbaijanis to slaughter one another. Tens of thousands died in the pogroms of 1905 and 1918, with Armenians getting the worst of it. By the time the Red Army invaded in 1920, Armenia and Azerbaijan were too exhausted from fighting each other to resist.
The conflict with the Azerbaijanis is a layered problem. First of all, Armenians see Azerbaijanis as Turks. They indeed are a Turkic people. They speak a Turkic language. They themselves see affinities with the Ottoman and post-Ottoman Turks. And so for Armenians, these are cousins of their greatest enemy.
And then there's the territorial problem.
Right, that a small part of what was historic Armenia, called Karabakh, or in Armenian Artsakh, ended up, both in the Tsarist period and the Soviet period, in what is now Azerbaijan.
Nagorno, or mountainous, Karabakh is the easternmost area of historic Armenia. Both Armenians and Azerbaijanis have lived there, but Armenians have been in the majority since the mid-1800s. When the Soviets carved out the republics, they shifted Armenia's borders to exclude Karabakh. And for nearly 70 years, Soviet power stifled disputes. But with Glasnost in the mid-80s, the Armenians organized a movement to reclaim the territory. Azerbaijanis countered with their own nationalistic demonstrations to retain Karabakh. The region's pre-Soviet history had resumed, with Azerbaijan struggling to become a nation and Armenia to remain one. Violence broke out in 1988. More than 1,000 people have died so far fighting over Karabakh, and the violence has spread throughout the two republics, creating hundreds of thousands of refugees on both sides. Even the earthquake that killed 25,000 Armenians failed to bring a truce, as Armenians claimed the Azerbaijanis blockaded relief supplies. Despite calls for a ceasefire, the death toll continues to mount in a struggle fueled by age-old ethnic hatred and newfound nationalist resolve.
The seesaw tide of battle between Armenian and Azerbaijani forces in Nagorno-Karabakh has swung towards the Armenian forces in recent weeks. With us are David Nisman, a longtime analyst with Radio Liberty and now a consultant, and Richard Hovhannissian, who is the Associate Director of the Near East Center at the University of California, Los Angeles. Mr. Hovhannissian, what can you add to throw light on this conflict as you understand it?
Well, certainly it's a combination of pre-Soviet territorial disputes that existed there, but also even more so the legacy of the Soviet nationality policy, which created these anomalies, which took territories of one ethnic group and placed them in the other. And what we found with the breakup of the Soviet Union, we have great degree of anxieties both by majorities and minorities in all the republics. In the case of Azerbaijan and Georgia, the Georgian and Azerbaijani minorities are afraid of the minorities breaking up the country, and in the case of the minorities, the fright that now that these states are independent, they will do away with all the possibilities, cultural freedom, and possibly even the physical existence of these minorities. It seems to be probably something of also of an anomaly that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the West and the world, in fact, recognized the boundaries that had been created by Stalin, by the Soviet Union, without questioning the legitimacy of the boundaries, and that's one of the problems here. I also should say, as Professor Suni has pointed out, that the burden of history or historical memory is very important for these people. For the Armenians, they were everywhere at the beginning of this century, from Constantinople or Istanbul to Baku. They filled in this whole area, not necessarily as majority, but everywhere present. And as a result of the genocide of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire in 1915-1918 period, the land on which Armenians have lived has been diminished continuously down to the 11,500 square miles that exists in the Republic of Armenia. Now, right next to this 11,500 square miles are the 1,700 square miles of Nagorno-Karabakh, which are still populated by Armenians, and which the Armenians feel must come back to the homeland. Now, what we have is a very serious clash of two very fundamental fundamental principles. And one is the principle of territorial integrity of states recognized by the international community, and this argument is put forward by Azerbaijan continuously because of the fact that Azerbaijan has been recognized, and in the United Nations Charter, one recognizes the territorial integrity. But next to that is also the principle of the right of self-determination of peoples and human rights. And of course, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, the 120,000 of them there living adjacent to Armenia, feel that if they do not now defend themselves and come out of Azerbaijan, that in fact they will physically be eliminated either by force or by having to leave the area.
Let me go to Mr. Nisman in Washington. Why do you think, this has been going on for 5 years now, why do you think that this can't be negotiated? Why is the desire to fight so strong with such losses among such a relatively small population?
Well, I think in Azerbaijan, the basic problem is that in the first period of this conflict, Karabakh was basically under Soviet control, and the entire problem was sort of mismanaged under Gorbachev. In the period of independence, Azerbaijan has known no government stability whatever. There's been no, let's say, clear-cut military strategy for winning, nor is there a peace strategy for achieving some form of peace between the two countries. I mean, the rank and file, of course, in Baku, for example, deplore the conflict on one hand, but on the other hand, the issue has been heightened by the fact that beginning in 1988, Azeri refugees began to show up, and it appeared that 2 years later, 250,000 had fundamentally been driven out of Armenia. And these people, arriving at a time of tremendous economic turmoil in Azerbaijan, sort of functioned there in the late 80s and early 90s as a kind of unemployed economic underclass, at the same time, sort of emphasizing the fact that they had been driven out of their native land. I mean, the point is that in the Transcaucasian territories, ethnic homogeny has not been very widespread. There's constantly been a mix. There have constantly been Armenians in Baku, and there have constantly been Azeris in what we call now Armenia. At the time, it was the Persian Empire, and then subsequently the Soviet Empire. Of course, this really didn't matter. These defined themselves as multi-ethnic or multinational societies. But now we're seeing an historical trend towards the creation of mono-ethnic states, the nation state.
Well, we'll pursue this situation, too, a little further in a moment. But first, let's go to the bloodiest fighting in the Central Asian Republic of Tajikistan, bordering Afghanistan. The conflict has elements of religious and regional quarrels between that country's 5 million people. Others see the fighting as a struggle between old-line communists and anti-communists. As many as 20,000 people have been killed and more than 300,000 left homeless, according to government estimates. We get two views now. Nancy Lubin is an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University and recently traveled with a congressional delegation to Central Asia. Firuz Kazemzadeh is a professor emeritus of history at Yale University. Nancy Lubin, which are the ethnic peoples fighting in Tajikistan and why?
Well, I think it's important to underline before we start that we normally look at the conflict in Tajikistan, which you rightly point out has been the bloodiest. More people have died in the Tajik conflict than all of the other conflicts on the territory of the former Soviet Union combined. So we are talking about probably the most major conflict. We normally look at this in ethnic, national, and religious terms. In fact, the irony perhaps about Tajikistan is that the root of this conflict was not Tajiks versus somebody else, but in fact it erupted Tajiks fighting each other, the Tajiks from the north fighting against the Tajiks from the south over, as Jack Matlock mentioned earlier, access to power, access to economic resources. The northern part of the country had been in control during the entire Soviet rule, had been very close to the communist government in Moscow and had reaped all of the benefits, or most of the benefits, in a ratio of some estimate 70-1 during the course of Soviet power. As the Soviet Union disintegrated, a natural competition for power and resources exploded, but among the Tajiks themselves. Islam played very little role, certainly up until a good year or so ago. The irony today is that what started as a non-ethnic and non-religious conflict is actually turning into one, where you have a continued infusion of Russian military into the region. You now have Uzbek forces in Tajikistan. You have the conflict lapping over now into Afghanistan. There are now Kazakh forces on the ground. And it's starting to take a very interethnic type of shape.
Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are two
Our
bordering
neighboring Central Asian
republics.
republic. Yeah. At the same time, especially among these 300,000 homeless who you mentioned, in a certain sense, without any other recourse, many are becoming radicalized, and the danger of Islamic fundamentalism taking hold is perhaps becoming more real, although I don't see that, happening now. So what started as a non-ethnic, non-religious conflict is actually turning into a very dangerous one.
Mr. Kazimzadeh, how much do you see that this as old-line communists trying to hold on against new anti-communists or former communists?
I think that essentially this is a correct analysis, but I would expand on this a little bit. I would say that Central Asia really never had a peaceful society. There were dynasties in the distant past that managed to hold by force a variety of peoples that did not constitute an ethnos or a nation. I think that Thomas Hobbes would have loved to write about Central Asia, where the war of all against all prevailed. The three great states of Central Asia in the last several centuries, Kokand, Bukhara, and Khiva, were ruled by Uzbeks, who constituted a kind of a semi-nomadic aristocracy. The cultural elite was Tajik, Persian-speaking, but nationality and ethnicity never governed the thoughts, the ideas of the population. And so within each one of these populations, there are conflicts that are more important, more significant to each group or to each nationality than inter-ethnic conflict.
Describe Moscow's involvement, and then I'll ask you the same question here. What is its interest? What is it doing in this particular struggle?
The borders now of Russia itself are very, very unclear. There are some people who feel those borders end at the northern part of Central Asia. There are others, given that most of the border troops on the Central Asian new countries themselves are Russian border troops, feel that in essence this is almost Russia's borders. There are an enormous number of Russian troops in the region. There are a good 10 or so million Russians living in the region. So one of the first interests
and
of
nowhere
Russia
else for them to go.
Some have been leaving, some to northern Kazakhstan, many, as a matter of fact, to northern Kazakhstan and then into Russia itself. But obviously there are tremendous complications with them leaving the region as well. So Russia's interests are protecting its own ethnically Russian populations, protecting its own borders in a sense, and protecting a regional conflict from expanding to the point where, with the legacy of Afghanistan very fresh in their minds, it becomes an immediate threat to their own interests as well.
How do you see Moscow's interest in this, Mr. Kazimzadeh?
Well, it seems to me that Moscow's interests are extremely significant. If you take Kazakhstan, the northernmost of these republics, that is as much Russia as it is Kazakhstan. There are as many Russians living in Kazakhstan as Kazakhs. Russian airlines, Russian railroads, Russian banks, that's what keeps that whole area operating. If the Russians should withdraw completely in 24 hours, the whole area would collapse. Moreover, there is a Russian imperial tradition, which makes it very difficult for the Russians to think of this area as anything except their sphere of influence.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's widen this out a bit now, starting with you, Elizabeth Teague, and look at it from the American perspective. The U.S. has a lot invested in Yeltsin and in Russian stability, not to mention what President Clinton referred to the prospect of great business prospects and one thing and another. How dangerous are these conflicts to that stability and to our interests there?
Russia, I think Russia's primary interest is not only, as you say, in its population in those countries, but also in stability on its borders. And I think this explains a lot of what Russia is doing. So Russia, in a way, is looking after those interests itself, in a way supporting leaders in Tajikistan, for example, who are extremely conservative in the terms of being old-line, hardline communists. And this is a pattern that's repeated in other places as well. And I think another concern very much of Russia's is the possibility of ethnic or national discontents spreading over Russia's borders and leading to the disintegration of Russia itself. The regionalization of Russia is proceeding apace, and various regions have declared themselves even sovereign republics, wanting to be sovereign states, this kind of thing.
Could this threaten Yeltsin and Russia's reform and regeneration?
Yes, that's really what I'm trying to get to, that I think that these could spill over and could lead to the further disintegration of Russia in an anarchic kind of way, not a controlled way.
How do you feel about that, Jack Matlock? Are they a threat to Russia's recovery, reform, all the things that we have such an interest and investment in?
Absolutely, because to the degree that civil war or fighting continues, and to the degree that Russia sees ethnic Russians threatened, certainly this brings great pressure to bear on the Yeltsin government at a time when they have enough problems without that. So in that sense, it clearly is a problem for them and indirectly for us.
Pressure that would lead him or force him into what kind of actions?
Well, first of all, we have the pressures for them to come in and protect resident Russians when fighting breaks out. And we see areas where, when fighting has broken out, either local commanders have acted in that way, and sometimes probably with the encouragement of Moscow. Or in the case of Tajikistan, you have Russian troops actually assigned there. Now, obviously, this leads to political pressure to play an increasingly imperialist role. But the fact is that if Russia plays an imperialist role, this is going to be rejected by the rest of the world and by their neighbors, and it will probably make democracy impossible in Russia itself. It seems to me that a Russian empire cannot be maintained in a democratic setting. It can only be an authoritarian or totalitarian system. And to the degree that we have an interest in democracy in Russia, we have an interest in seeing these conflicts settled without bringing Russia to, enticing them back into an imperial role.
Nancy Lubin, whom I forgot to mention, is a fellow of the U.S. Institute of Peace when I was introducing her. What factors do you see in these three different but somehow related, if only because of the former Soviet republics, struggles in terms of the way we look at things?
Yeah, I think the conflicts are really only part of what really does represent, in my mind, a tremendous and growing challenge to our own national security interests, and not only to Russian national security interests. I would add, since Russia is part of our own interest, that while the Russians are pushing for stability in the area, their role has not always been a positive one, and is not viewed as such even among their own Russian populations. There have been calls already among the Russian populations to bring the boys home, and the atrocities that have been documented by both Western and local sources that the Russian troops themselves are carrying out.
Continuing to, or is that back in the Gorbachev days?
No, these reports are very, very recent, along with the local communist government officials, and there have been many documented atrocities up until very recently, even on German TV.
Atrocities like what?
A few that come to mind are one that was just shown on German TV, was Russian soldiers returning home and documenting atrocities on the Afghan border of Russian troops with sledgehammers, burgeoning people to death and then shooting them. There are pictures throughout the Russian press of local communist leaders in their offices with pictures of Lenin behind them, slicing off the ear of somebody in the opposition before slaughtering them. Amnesty International has come out with a report that documents many of these atrocities. And I bring them up not to lay blame on any side, but I think in determining our own interests, we have to be very clear about what role supposed peacekeeping forces are playing, what role local governments are playing, and what in fact the opposition wants. these are tied together briefly for the rest of your question with a slew of other issues, like nuclear proliferation, which is already definitely an issue in the region, narcotics trafficking, which is sore. The Central Asian region alone is the second largest, second only to Burma, opium poppy growing region in the world. Burma has 360,000 acres, Central Asia has 300,000, and third in line by a factor of 10 is Afghanistan with only 30,000. With no law enforcement, with totally permeable borders, this is becoming a major local concern. Environmental devastation, economic devastation, the corruption and organized crime that was mentioned earlier, all of these are issues that are at the source of the conflict there and will affect our own interests here if we're not more cognizant of what's going on in the region now.
Let's just ask another aspect of this. Mr. Kazimzadeh, could these conflicts spread and draw in neighboring countries? We've seen that on those borders there is Turkey, there is Iran, both major powers in the area.
I think that Turkey could conceivably be drawn into the problems of Transcaucasia, particularly
Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yes, particularly if Armenians achieve important military victories and occupy large territories in Azerbaijan. The Turks may feel compelled to act.
You mean actually to send troops in?
Yes, that could happen. It happened on many occasions before. As far as Iran is concerned, I don't think that they can do very much about Central Asia. People talk about Islamic fundamentalism in Central Asia. First of all, I agree with Ms. Lubin. It's a minor element. And in the second place, Iranian Islam is Shiite. Central Asians, all of them, including the Persian-speaking Tajiks, are Sunnis and don't have any particular attachment to the Islamic regime in Iran.
Mr. Hovhannissian, what do you think of the prediction that Turkey could be drawn in if the Armenians continue to do well militarily?
Well, I would hope that they would not intervene. It's already very complex. Turkey already has been sending various kinds of assistance to Azerbaijan. I think that's rather clear, and they've had a military cooperation pact that was announced. Late President Ozal made some very threatening remarks regarding the Armenians. From the Armenian perspective, they would hope that the West would take somewhat a more involved attitude. Armenia has been under economic blockade for the last 4 to 5 years, and every winter thousands of people are dying from malnutrition, cold, freezing weather, a lack of electricity, and so forth. The role of Turkey, of course, the Armenians are very much concerned about the role of Turkey and also the role of Iran. And from the point of view of the United States, it seems to me that there is a very important stake here in looking at the equation. Also, from the point of view of Turkey, as long as this conflict goes on, there is a threat of fundamentalism, if there is a fear of that, increasing in countries such as Turkey, which are secular states. The other point is that there is some concern in the Caucasus, and perhaps even in the Turkic republics of the Caucasus, that Turkish influence can in fact become too strong in the region, supported by the United States, because the United States opposition currently to Iranian influence in the other
and Turkey being a NATO member.
And a NATO member, and much preferring Turkish influence there. Now, for the Armenians, that only increases this fear, obsession with pan-Turkism, from which they were victimized in World War I, but also for countries such as Azerbaijan, from the historical experience, it seems to me that they also need to curb Turkish influence. They of course have a great deal of affinity and very supportive of one another, but on the other hand, they want to protect their own sovereignty and independence.
Excuse me, cutting you off. I have less than a minute left here. I just wanted to ask Mr. Niesman how he sees the prospect of neighboring countries getting involved and complicating this.
I think that the interest of both Turkey and Iran is basically that some form of stability, economic stability especially, be created in the region so that they could continue their business of opening up new marketplaces. That was what they had both expected to do at the time that the Soviet Union was dissolved. And of course, the ethnic conflicts have confused us. This is why there were so many efforts by Rafsanjani and why Turkey has also made an effort, and why Turkey thus far has not intervened. It has been resisting intervention. So I think the stability of the region is paramount for both countries.
Jack Matlock, briefly, is there anything the United States can do except sit and watch this?
Not very much, though I think that we should be taking an interest, and certainly we should take a lead in trying to develop new standards and new mechanisms to defend human rights in these areas and everywhere. We are members of the CSCE, and all these successor states are also members. We should be looking for new mechanisms there to bring pressure to bear on them to establish human rights standards within their countries so that we can move toward a peaceful way of settling these disputes.
Well, Mr. Matlock, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all.
Again, weather was the major story of this Thursday. Floodwaters rose to record levels along the Mississippi River, and there was record heat on the East Coast with temperatures in the high 90s and low hundreds from South Carolina into New England. Also today in Tokyo, the Big Seven summit leaders announced a $3 billion aid package for Russia. They also warned the Serbs and Croats in Bosnia against partitioning the republic by force. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Roger. That's the News Hour for tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Major funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer News Hour has been provided by PepsiCo.